God! Oh!
On this Wednesday night, Hurricane Idalia roars ashore.
Oh, pieces are flying off.
The widespread destruction and why the storm intensified so quickly before it hit Florida. Ethics rules violated. The blistering new report blasting Ontario's government over the controversial Greenbelt land swap. Fresh concerns about the Senate minority leader in the U.S.
All right, I'm sorry, you all. We're going to need a minute.
Mitch McConnell appears to freeze again while taking questions from reporters. And major buzzkill, a warning from police in one Canadian city about 5 million bees.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Whoa.
This is the fierce strength of Hurricane Idalia, pounding Florida's west coast as it roared ashore today. The eye of that storm so powerful, it kicked up a storm surge and brought winds not seen in a lifetime. Officials say 1,000 bridges need to be inspected now before they're considered safe, and the damage extends far beyond where the hurricane made landfall, though it's now been downgraded to a tropical storm. Good evening and thanks for joining us. Those in the hurricane's path were warned to get out. Not everyone did, and there are reports some had to swim to safety. Jackson Proskow has our top story tonight.
This part of Florida hasn't seen a storm like this in over a century. Hurricane Idalia brought ferocious wind and incredible rain to Florida's Big Bend.
Oh my God! Oh!
It was the storm surge that proved most dangerous.
Everything under the back of your house is completely underwater.
Record high levels of water, nearly 5 meters deep, were pushed on shore.
It doesn't look good. All of our commercial buildings downtown are underwater. A huge percentage of our homes have been inundated with water. You can see I'm standing in the middle of State Road 24 right now, and it's completely underwater.
Coastal communities were inundated. Roads became rivers. Those who ignored warnings to leave needed to be rescued.
We got high tide coming and the water didn't go out.
Ahead of landfall, Idalia's rapid intensification is what worried officials the most. A storm for the ages that grew rapidly in the ultra-warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico.
It's going to be a big deal, and it's going to be very dangerous. And there we go with our power here.
Hundreds of flights were canceled across the region as airports shuttered. Though major cities like Tampa were spared the worst of it, flooding was still a problem. Parts of Fort Myers, still rebuilding from Hurricane Ian, were submerged again. In Tampa, the waterfront went under.
The flooding is unbelievable. Bayshore Boulevard is completely underwater.
Idalia quickly barreled across Florida and into Georgia, where it brought more high wind and the risk of inland flooding.
It's a dangerous storm. People need to prepare. They need to be ready when it's coming through.
It will take days to assess the damage. Some residents could be in the dark even longer, as the year's first major storm delivered a warning that hurricane season is reaching its peak. Jackson Proskow, Global News.
Hurricanes are named by the World Meteorological Organization, and the names get reused unless they are monster storms. Idalia begins with the letter I, and more storms that start with an I have been retired than any other letter of the alphabet because they were deadly or destructive. 14 names have been crossed off that list, about 15%. Hurricane Ian is the most recent. That Category 4 storm killed more than 150 people in Florida last year and caused $155 billion worth of damage, a record in that state. There is an explanation for this odd group: timing. The intensity of the Atlantic hurricane season builds at the end of August and peaks around the second week of September. To help put this latest hurricane into context, Global News meteorologist Anthony Farnell is with me. Anthony, Idalia intensified with frightening speed as it approached Florida. Why did that happen? Is it going to become more common?
Well, it certainly has been more common, Donna, over the course of the last few years at least. These storms intensifying quickly. It was well forecasted by the National Hurricane Center, but still, that doesn't make it any less scary. And you see our satellite imagery here showing that pinpoint eye right before landfall. Thankfully, it was a rather small, compact storm, so the damage was less widespread than some of the other big ones. But look at this. Since 2017, all of these major hurricanes have reached their strongest point within about 100 kilometers of land. So that is a troubling sign that we're seeing in the Gulf of Mexico, partially to blame the very warm water. Now, this is deviations from normal, 30 to 32 degrees Celsius water. Typically, you need about 26 degrees Celsius to get a hurricane to form. And it's not just the Gulf of Mexico. We've got warm water because of El Nino in the Pacific. Much of the Atlantic is above seasonal, and that is a troubling sign for the next few weeks as hurricane season really ramps up, Donna.
It is troubling. And Anthony, we fear winds from a hurricane, of course, but the storm surge is a real threat too, especially in this case.
Especially in this case, yeah, it's really the orientation of the coastline, the fact that it's rather shallow shelf water here in this Big Bend area of Florida. But also when you have these major hurricanes intensifying right up until landfall, the winds bring a lot of water into places it shouldn't be. That was Idalia. I do want to quickly mention that this big eye you see here, that's another hurricane. It's Category 2 strength Franklin, originally a Category 4 just a couple of days ago. Big waves up and down the eastern seaboard, but also it's having an effect bringing some tropical moisture even into Atlantic Canada, where rainfall warnings are in place, anywhere from 50 to 100 millimeters falling in an area that has had already a record wet summer. So there is a flood threat indirectly from Franklin for Atlantic Canada. Newfoundland also seeing rain through tomorrow. Donna?
Okay, Global News meteorologist Anthony Farnell, thank you. The government of Ontario and Premier Doug Ford are being slammed yet again for the controversial plan to remove land from the protected Greenbelt around Toronto so that developers can build homes on it. Ontario's Integrity Commissioner calls the land swap a rushed and flawed process marred by a lack of oversight, and that, he says, led to the private interests of certain developers being furthered improperly. He recommends the housing minister be reprimanded. Colin Demello is following this from Queen's Park in Toronto. Colin, the Integrity Commissioner didn't mince his words today. How serious is this?
Well, the Ford government has already been consumed by controversy for the past few weeks, Donna, but this only added more fuel to the fire. The Integrity Commissioner found that Ontario's Housing Minister Steve Clark was primarily to blame here. It was his responsibility to carry out the removal of the Greenbelt lands, but the Integrity Commissioner found that Clark deliberately stuck his head in the sand because he knew this was going to be a politically sensitive file. Instead, he says he handed over the responsibility to his chief of staff, who rushed through the process and created a chaotic process as a result. There are growing calls for Steve Clark to either resign or to be fired, but the Premier today issued a statement saying he stands by the Housing Minister. They will fix the process, but he says the Housing Minister is still the best person equipped to carry out the province's goal of building 1.5 million homes over this coming decade.
And so what happens now, Colin? Will there be any consequences?
Oh, that is yet to be seen. This is going to be growing politically anyway for the government. The question is, what did the Premier know and when? It was he who kicked off the process by instructing the Housing Minister to remove lands from the Greenbelt. It was the Premier who ultimately approved the removals of those specific pieces of land. The questions of whether the Premier knew exactly who was benefiting from this deal will become important in the days ahead. The Premier is set to take questions tomorrow in his home riding in Etobicoke, just a little bit west of Queen's Park.
Okay, Colin Demello in Toronto, thanks. The Canadian Armed Forces says it's dropping its duty to report policy after a recommendation from retired Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour in her report on the military's handling of sexual misconduct. The duty to report policy made it mandatory for members to report all instances of misconduct, including sexual misconduct or racism, whether they were directly affected by it or not. Arbour says the unintended consequence is that in many cases it caused survivors additional harm by taking away their agency and control over the reporting process. The aim is to allow military members to report issues of misconduct on their own terms, just like in the civilian justice system. The policy is expected to be removed in the winter. Canada's population hit a milestone this year, reaching 40 million. And now a report has found the official number of non-permanent residents in Canada could be vastly underestimated, meaning even more people are living here than the official number reflects. And that would mean government policies, especially around housing, aren't based on real numbers. Mackenzie Gray explains.
Tackling the housing crisis just got a lot harder, and not for the reason you'd think. The latest culprit? A statistical error.
I believe that we are undercounting the number of non-permanent residents in Canada by roughly 1 million.
CIBC's deputy chief economist, Benjamin Tall, estimating official government figures on immigration are wrong. He believes 750,000 non-permanent residents, mainly international students, have overstayed their visas and are still in Canada. And an additional 250,000 were not properly counted in the most recent census. Calculations Tall briefed the Prime Minister and his cabinet on last week in Charlottetown.
This is something that we have to fix because it has major implications for demand for housing. And if we are undercounting them, we are also undercounting demand for housing and therefore misallocating resources.
Implications also for key data from the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation, which estimated 5.8 million new housing units must be built by 2030, but that's based on potentially inaccurate census data.
Great as the need is for housing, we've actually underestimated the need.
To reduce rental demand, Housing Minister Sean Fraser floated the idea of a cap on international student visas.
We've got temporary immigration programs that were never designed to see such explosive growth in such a short period of time.
One of many ideas Tall believes government should implement.
This is a major crisis and it's getting worse and worse. We have to run faster to stay in the same place because supply is not rising and demand is rising very, very quickly.
CIBC estimates that the potential undercount of non-permanent residents means there'll need to be an additional 2 years' worth of building at current rates, Donna, to soak up the additional demand in the Canadian housing market.
Okay, Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa, thanks. An incident with a trailer load of beehives in Burlington, Ontario this morning had beekeepers running to the rescue. Crates containing about 5 million bees came loose from the trailer, spilling onto a road and allowing many of the bees to escape. Local beekeepers came to help, putting the crates back on the trailer. Police urged motorists passing by to keep their windows up. They told pedestrians to avoid the area. It took a couple of hours, and a few crates are being left behind, so the bees that escaped will return to them at some point, and the beekeepers will come and collect them. No word on how many people were stung. A military coup in another African nation. Coming up, the dispute over Gabon's election and the jubilation in the streets. Russian officials claim Ukraine launched the biggest nighttime drone attack on Russian soil since the beginning of the war. Cell phone video shows the moment drones reportedly hit an airport in western Russia near the border with Estonia and Latvia early Wednesday. At least 4 transport aircraft were said to be damaged. Drone attacks were also reported in at least 5 other Russian regions. The attacks coincide with Moscow's largest missile and drone attacks on Kyiv in months. At least 2 people were killed after an overnight bombardment that left several others injured. Ukrainian officials say more than 20 missiles and drones were destroyed by air defense systems in the region. And a little later, we'll have an inside look at how those Russian airstrikes have pushed learning underground in one of Ukraine's biggest cities. The longtime leader of Gabon is under house arrest tonight after military officers claim to have seized power in the Central African nation. Gabon on Africa's west coast has a population of about 2.3 million people. The coup happened just hours after the president was declared the winner of a controversial election, which would have extended his family's 55-year reign. Mike Armstrong has the story.
The military coup was announced overnight, and this was the reaction when the capital woke up, cheering crowds celebrating in the streets of Libreville. This is independence, this woman says. The army has liberated our country. A military spokesman called the coup a step for the people of the country on the road to happiness, announcing the longtime president is now under house arrest. Ali Bongo cast his ballot Saturday in the presidential election. According to Gabon's Electoral Commission, he won with just over 64% of the vote. The soldiers now say they are canceling those results and dissolving the institutions of the republic.
Right now,
Bongo was allowed to release a statement in English from house arrest. He called on supporters to speak out.
Nothing is happening. I don't know what's going on. So I'm calling you to make noise.
Now, there was serious criticism of the recent election. The main opposition candidate was given only 8 days to campaign and then said some polling stations didn't have his name on ballots. There were no international observers or international media.
L'accès à Internet.
And the government cut off access to the internet. It said to cut down on false information.
Le devoir de ma charge.
Bongo and his father before him have led the country for 55 years. And despite a wealth of natural resources, about a third of the population lives below the poverty line. If the public appears to support the coup, analysts say it's because many were frustrated.
They were asking themselves, why should he be elected yet again and in a process which doesn't look terribly transparent?
Sub-Saharan Africa has had several military coups in the last 4 years. The most recent was Niger just last month. The reasons may be different, but seeing successful coups in other countries was likely an influence, if not inspiration. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
This happens every year in a village near Valencia, Spain. It's a tomato fight, in case you couldn't tell, and people travel from all over the world for it, hopefully with goggles. It's known as La Tomatina. It originated in 1945. It was banned in the 1950s, but survived and surged in popularity. Nearly 110,000 kilos of overripe and low-quality tomatoes were used or abused in just 1 hour this year. Ahead, medical concerns about Mitch McConnell after a second episode in 2 months. In the U.S., the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell froze again today while he was taking questions from reporters.
What are my thoughts about what?
Running for re-election in 2026.
That's
Did you hear the question, Senator? Running for re-election in 2026?
Yes.
All right, I'm sorry, you all. We're going to need a minute.
McConnell, who is 81 years old, was silent for about 20 seconds. He was guided away by staff. He returned several minutes later saying he was fine. It's the second time this has happened this summer. The Republican lawmaker froze during a press conference on Capitol Hill in July. An aide said today McConnell will consult a doctor before his next event as a prudent measure. A landmark moment for Indigenous rights in Australia. That country is set to vote on changing the constitution to create a so-called Indigenous voice to Parliament. The referendum, the country's first in 24 years, will be held October 14th. If successful, an Indigenous advisory group will be formed to advise government on laws and issues that directly impact Indigenous Australians. Supporters say embedding the Indigenous body within the Constitution will help Australia heal after generations of racial injustice. Live and learn next. The underground classrooms aimed at keeping Ukrainian students safe from Russia's war. Returning to school is top of mind for parents and students in lots of countries right now. And in Ukraine, the stress is unimaginable. UNICEF says more than 1,300 schools have been destroyed in the country since Moscow's full-scale invasion. Only about a third of school-aged children are able to attend class in person. One of Ukraine's biggest cities is looking to change that by taking classrooms underground. Crystal Gamansing explains.
Ukraine's underground metro system has been a lifesaver, especially in Kharkiv. The eastern city lies on the border with Russia, and the bombardments have been relentless. The bunker-style stations make for secure locations for learning. We will have desks, an interactive board, Wi-Fi, tutors, and psychologists will be here. Victoria Kuznetsova is head of the Metro University project and gave a tour of what will be 60 classrooms for 1,000 students. Soundproofing, ventilation, and fire alarms are being added. I support that the children will study in the subway, says this mother. She adds she's glad they'll be able to socialize in classes twice a week for 3 hours. UNICEF has been tracking the loss of safe learning spaces for students and asking how it's impacted them.
These senseless and reckless attacks have left many of Ukrainian children deeply distressed and without a safe space to learn.
4 educational workers were killed in the Sumy region last week as they were preparing for the upcoming academic year. In Kharkiv region, the governor says Russian troops damaged 640 and destroyed 72 educational institutions. My children will attend online classes, though our school offered a bus to transfer children to the subway. Informal learning has been taking place in metro stations, but as Kharkiv works to set up traditional classrooms, the idea of traveling back and forth to attend school is seen by some parents as an unnecessary risk. Crystal Gamanson, Global News, London.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's your Canada is Toronto's CN Tower and the rare super blue moon. Here's what that means. A supermoon happens when the moon is full during the closest point in its orbit around Earth, making it appear bigger and brighter than a regular full moon. And this one's called a blue moon, not because it's blue, but because it is the second full moon of the month, which is extremely rare, once in a blue moon. Its visibility peaks tonight. There won't be another super blue moon until 2037. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.